The year 1881 clawed at Sagebrush Crossing with fingers of red dust. It wasn't a storm so much as a siege. The wind, born somewhere in the vast, unforgiving plains of Texas, screamed down the town's single artery of a main street, carrying with it the grit and soul of the land. It hammered against the false fronts of the general store and the land office, making the unpainted wood shudder. Shutters, forgotten or broken, slapped a frantic, irregular tattoo against window frames, a sound like a panicked heart. The saloon sign, a crude painting of a smiling woman holding a foaming beer, didn't swing. It groaned on its iron hooks, a low, mournful sound of metal grinding against metal, as if the painted lady herself were weary of the endless wind. Through the swirling ochre haze, a figure held his ground. Jonah Vale sat atop his sturdy roan gelding, a man carved from the same hard earth the wind was trying to reclaim. He wasn't fighting the storm, merely enduring it, a familiar and thankless task. His hat was pulled low, the brim stiff with accumulated grime and sweat. A faded bandana, once blue, was tied high over his nose and mouth, but he could still taste the alkaline bite of the dust. His duster, the color of wet sand, was heavy, each fiber impregnated with the fine, abrasive powder that got into everything: a man's lungs, his food, his temper. He kept a steady, gloved hand on the reins, his knuckles prominent and scarred. The horse, Boulder, stood with its head lowered, tail pressed tight against its powerful haunches, trusting the man on its back to know when to move and when to stand. They were an island of stillness in the chaos, two beings locked in a silent, shared patience. Jonah's gaze, narrowed against the stinging grit, was fixed on the far end of the street, where the wooden bridge spanned the shallow, sluggish creek that gave the town its name. The bridge was the town's lifeline, its connection to the stagecoach route, to the mail, to the world beyond this dusty pocket of existence. It was there that the day's rhythm finally broke. The overland mail coach, already late, appeared through the haze like a lumbering ghost. The team of 4 horses, their coats dark with sweat and caked with mud-like dust, strained against their harnesses. The driver, a silhouette hunched against the gale, cracked his whip, the sound stolen and shredded by the wind. On the bench beside him sat a smaller figure, a woman, holding her hat against the onslaught with one hand and gripping the seat rail with the other. As the coach hit the first planks of the bridge, there was a sound that cut through the wind's howl, a high-pitched shriek of tortured metal, followed by a violent, splintering crack. The left front wheel, suddenly untethered, wobbled drunkenly for a moment before tearing free from the axle. It bounced once, twice, then rolled with a life of its own into the murky creek below. The coach, its balance shattered, pitched forward and sideways with a groan of protesting wood. The horses, terrified, screamed and tried to bolt, their shod hooves scrabbling for purchase on the wooden planks, their movements made chaotic and deadly by the tangled harnesses. The woman on the driver's bench was thrown, not with a scream, but with a sharp, involuntary cry of surprise. She was airborne for a heart-stopping second, a tangle of dark skirt and flailing limbs, before she landed hard on the dusty ground just shy of the bridge, perilously close to the path of the lurching, out-of-control coach. For a moment, she lay stunned, the breath knocked from her lungs. Then her head lifted, her bonnet askew, revealing a face smudged with dirt. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, didn't hold fear. They blazed with a fierce, pure anger. Before the first whisper could ripple through the few townspeople watching from the shelter of doorways, Jonah moved. There was no thought, only instinct. He spurred Boulder forward, a single, sharp command. The horse responded instantly, closing the distance in 3 powerful strides. Jonah swung himself out of the saddle while the roan was still moving, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. He didn't check his stride. 2 long, ground-eating steps, and he was there. He reached down, his arm scooping her up from the ground. The movement was economical, efficient, devoid of any gentleness but full of purpose. She was lighter than he'd expected, yet solid. He felt the tension in her body, the rigid set of her muscles as he lifted her clear of the ground. The broken coach shuddered to a halt just inches from where she had lain, its iron-rimmed rear wheels sinking into the soft earth. For a moment, he held her, the world a maelstrom of dust and noise around them. Her face was close to his, and he could feel her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. A stray strand of dark auburn hair had escaped her bun and whipped across his cheek, smelling of rain and something faintly herbal, a clean scent that cut through the oppressive odor of dust and horse sweat. His hands, rough and calloused from rope and rain and iron, felt the surprisingly soft fabric of her dress, the warmth of her body through the layers of cotton. He smelled the acrid tang of gunpowder that clung to his own clothes, a permanent perfume from cleaning his rifle, and the rich, animal scent of horse leather from his gloves. She pushed against his chest, a weak but determined movement. "Put me down," she gasped, the words tight with pain and indignation. She took another shaky breath, gently now. Jonah gave a single, curt nod. He turned and carried her to the sheltered alcove of the general store's porch, where sacks of cornmeal and flour were stacked, waiting to be loaded. He bent and carefully, deliberately, set her down to sit on a large sack of cornmeal. The sack yielded slightly under her weight, a soft and forgiving perch. He stepped back, his posture stiff, his hands falling to his sides. The bandana was still over his face, hiding his expression, but his eyes, pale gray like a winter sky, were fixed on her. The moment the immediate danger was past, the town's tongues began to wag. From the gaping doorway of the saloon, a grizzled trapper named Silas muttered to his companion, "That's Vale for you. Moves like a catamount when he has to. Says nothing when he don't." Martha, the blacksmith's wife, stood with her arms crossed, her apron flapping in the wind. "Heard he hasn't hired a new ranch hand since the last one quit 6 months ago. Says he prefers the company of his cattle." She clucked her tongue. "No woman stayed at Red Kestrel for more than a season. It ain't natural for a man to be that alone." The whispers were part of the town's fabric, threads of speculation and history woven around the quiet, solitary rancher. Jonah heard them, or perhaps he simply felt them, the way an animal feels a change in the air. He paid them no mind. His attention was on the woman. Lila Rowan pressed her lips into a thin, white line, ignoring the curious stares. Pain, sharp and electric, was shooting up from her left ankle. She reached down, her movements practiced and sure, and her fingers gently probed the area around her boot. She diagnosed the problem with a grim certainty, a bad sprain, possibly a fracture. Without hesitation, she began to unlace her sturdy leather boot. As she worked, she watched the man named Vale from under her lashes. He hadn't left. He stood like a sentinel, his broad shoulders blocking the worst of the wind. He was tall, with the lean, hard-muscled build of a man who spent his days in the saddle. The dust couldn't hide the harsh lines of his face, the strong set of his jaw visible even beneath the bandana. He was a man who seemed to have no soft edges, a man shaped by work and solitude. There was a stillness about him that was unsettling, a self-contained quiet that seemed to swallow the noise around him. He didn't fidget or shift his weight. He just watched, his pale eyes missing nothing, while Lila's focus was on her ankle and the silent man. Another scene played out, almost invisible in the choking dust on the far side of the bridge. A figure, swathed in a dark coat, detached himself from the shadows of the cottonwood trees lining the creek. His face was obscured by a bandana pulled high, just like Jonah's, but his was black. He knelt, his movements quick and furtive, and picked something small and metallic from the wooden planks. A wheel nut. He palmed it, the piece of iron disappearing into his gloved hand. He cast a single fleeting glance back toward the chaos of the wrecked coach, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second on Jonah Vale. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he melted back into the swirling red curtain of the storm and was gone. Lila had her boot off now. She grimaced as a fresh wave of pain washed over her. Ignoring it, she tore a long, clean strip from her petticoat. A broken piece of a shipping crate lying nearby provided 2 flat pieces of wood, with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. She began to fashion a crude but effective splint, her fingers moving with a surgeon's precision. She worked in a bubble of concentration. Her world narrowed to the task at hand. Jonah watched her, a flicker of something: surprise, perhaps respect in his eyes. He had expected tears or hysterics. He had not expected this quiet, fierce competence, this refusal to be a victim. The stagecoach driver, a portly man named Hank, had finally managed to calm the horses with the help of the blacksmith. He approached Jonah, wiping a dusty sleeve across his sweating brow. "Much obliged. Vale, that was a close thing. Don't know what came over that wheel?" Jonah didn't turn his head. His gaze remained on Lila. He gave a slight shake of his head, a gesture that could have meant anything. He walked over to the crippled coach. He put his shoulder to the rear of the heavy vehicle, his muscles bunching under his coat. "Give me a hand." "Hank," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough with disuse, like stones grinding together. Together, they managed to push and drag the coach to the side of the road, clearing the entrance to the bridge. The work was hard, their boots slipping in the deep dust, their breaths coming in harsh pants. When it was done, Jonah straightened up, slapping the dust from his gloves. He turned, and his eyes found Lila's again. She had finished her work. The splint was neatly tied, her ankle immobilized. She was leaning back against the cornmeal sack, her face pale with exhaustion and pain, but her expression was composed. Her moss-green eyes met his gray ones across the 20 feet of dusty ground that separated them. The wind howled, whipping grit between them. The saloon sign groaned its weary complaint. The townspeople began to drift back to their own business. The brief drama concluded, but for a long moment, Jonah and Lila remained locked in that gaze. It lasted a beat longer than was necessary, a beat longer than was comfortable. In that silent space, something passed between them, an acknowledgement, a recognition of the hardness in each other. He saw a resilience that matched the unforgiving land, and she saw a strength as quiet and profound as the mountains on the horizon. Then he pulled down his bandana, revealing a firm mouth and a jaw shadowed with stubble. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of finality. He turned without a word, walked to his horse, swung himself into the saddle, and rode into the dust, disappearing as completely as if he had never been there at all. The air in the sagebrush crossing bank was still and smelled of stale paper and oiled metal. It was a calculated stillness, designed to make a man feel the weight of his own breathing. Luther Pike, the bank's owner, sat behind a desk of polished oak that seemed too large for the small room, a throne in a dusty kingdom. He was a man built of soft lines and sharp angles, a plump body encased in a tailored suit, but with eyes that were small, hard, and quick, like a coyote's. He slid a stack of papers across the desk toward Jonah Vale. The edges of the deed to the Red Kestrel Ranch were worn, the ink faded, but the legal power it held was as fresh and binding as the day it was signed. "The note comes due at the end of the month." "Jonah," Pike said, his voice smooth and oiled as the lock on his vault. "You know the terms. The interest has compounded." He steepled his fingers, the nails clean and buffed. "It's a significant sum." Jonah did not look at the papers. He knew what they said. He could feel their words pressed against his chest like a physical weight. He kept his gaze on Pike's face, his own expression unreadable. "I'll have it." Pike smiled, a thin, bloodless motion of the lips. "I'm sure you will. But the land is dry. The herd is thin this year. A man can't draw water from a stone, can he?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "There are always other options. A man with as much land as you has more than just cattle to sell." Jonah's hands, resting on his knees, were clenched into fists. He said nothing. Silence was his shield and sometimes his weapon. After a long moment, he stood, the legs of his chair scraping against the floorboards. The sound was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. He walked out without another word. leaving Pike's smile to curdle in the stillness. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, and the papers for Red Kestrel lay on the desk like a death sentence awaiting a signature. Across the street, in a cleared-out corner of the general store's storeroom, a different kind of transaction was taking place. Lila Rowan had finished setting up her clinic. It wasn't much. A clean cot, a small wooden table for her instruments, and a tall cabinet she'd bought from the blacksmith, its shelves now neatly lined with glass bottles of carbolic acid, iodine, and neatly rolled bandages. The air smelled of turpentine and lavender, a clean, medicinal scent that fought back against the perpetual dust. Using a piece of charcoal, she carefully lettered a sign on a smooth plank of pine. She didn't write her name or qualifications. The sign said only consultation by ability to pay. She hung it from a nail by the storeroom door. Elias, the store owner, a kind man with worry lines etched around his eyes, watched her. That's mighty generous. "Miss Rowan," he said, shifting a barrel of pickles, "but generosity don't buy laudanum. It builds trust." "Elias," she replied, wiping charcoal dust from her fingers, "and trust is better currency than coin in a place like this." She looked around her small domain. It was a start, a place to mend the town's bodies, if not its soul. The town, for its part, was already whispering. The wind that carried the dust also carried words, and they settled in the saloon and over the Cracker Barrel at Elias's store. "Heard the railroad is surveying a new spur line," one man said, spitting tobacco juice into a cuspidor, "right through the Sweetwater Marsh. That's worthless land." Another scoffed, "Bog and mosquitoes. Not to the railroad it ain't. They need a straight shot to the silver mines up north. Cheaper than going over the foothills." And whose land borders that whole marsh? Every eye in the room knew the answer. Vale's land. And who holds the note on Vale's land? The name hung in the air. Unspoken, but understood Luther Pike. The whispers wove a story of their own. A story of progress, steel rails, and a banker who always seemed to know which way the wind was about to blow. Miles away, under a sun that felt like a hammer. Jonah was living the hard truth of those whispers. He rode the fence line of his ranch, the silence broken only by the creak of his saddle and the lowing of his calves. Red Kestrel was a spread of rolling hills and sparse grassland, bordered on one side by the impassable granite of the foothills, and on the other by the murky, treacherous Sweetwater Marsh. It was good land, honest land, but it was thirsty. The spring rains had been a ghost, a mere suggestion on the horizon that never arrived. The grass was stunted, pale green and brittle. The creek that fed his stock was running low and slow. He was counting the new calves, his lips moving silently. The tally was lower than last year. The mothers were thin, their ribs showing like washboards beneath their hides. He dismounted near a watering trough, his boots sinking into the dry, cracked earth. He ran a hand through the sparse grass. It crumbled to dust in his palm. He'd have to sell off part of the herd early, before they lost more weight. He'd get a poor price, not nearly enough to satisfy Pike. The thought was a lead weight in his gut. This land wasn't just dirt and rock to him. It was his father's sweat, his own blood, the quiet promise he'd made to the brother he'd lost. Selling any piece of it felt like a betrayal. He stood for a long time, a solitary figure in a vast, empty landscape, the loneliness of the place seeping into his bones. In town, Lila was not lonely, but she was an outsider. A small group of Mescalero Apache had set up a temporary camp on the edge of town, and a young mother had brought her child to Lila's clinic. The boy was burning with fever, his breathing shallow. Lila worked calmly, sponging the boy's face and chest with cool water, forcing a tincture of willow bark and chamomile between his chapped lips. She was aware of the eyes on her. Martha, the blacksmith's wife, stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her lips pursed in disapproval. "Some say it ain't right, treating them," she said, her voice loud enough to carry. "They have their own medicine. Fever doesn't care what language you speak." "Martha," Lila said without looking up, her focus entirely on the sick child, "and my medicine is for anyone who needs it." Her tone was even, but there was a steel edge to it that made Martha huff and turn away. Lila knew she was making no friends among the town's more rigid-minded citizens, but it was a price she was willing to pay. A few days later, Lila saw Jonah at the town well. He was hauling up buckets of water for his horse, his back to her, the muscles in his shoulders and arms working with a powerful rhythm. He'd left something on the well's stone ledge, a simple cotton handkerchief, folded neatly but worn thin from use. In one corner, 2 letters were embroidered in faded blue thread, G.V. It must have fallen from his pocket during his work. She picked it up. The cotton was soft, almost silky from countless washings. She walked over as he was tipping a full bucket into the trough. "You forgot this," she said. He turned, his movements economical, no wasted motion. His eyes registered first the handkerchief, then her. He took it from her offered hand, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. His skin was rough, calloused, but warm. "Thanks," he said. The word was dry, scraped from his throat. She offered a small, tentative smile. Her ankle was still tightly wrapped, but she could now put weight on it, and the fire of her initial anger had cooled to a quiet curiosity about this man. "That's the second word I've heard you speak." He looked at her, his pale eyes guarded. He didn't know how to respond to banter. She pressed on gently. "You need to learn more words." A muscle twitched in his jaw. He stuffed the handkerchief into his pocket, gave another one of his curt, non-committal nods, and turned back to the well. The conversation, for him, concluded. Lila watched him for a moment longer before turning and walking away, a thoughtful frown on her face. That evening, as Jonah was leaving the feed store, Luther Pike stepped out of the saloon's swinging doors, blocking his path. A false, welcoming smile was plastered on the banker's face. "Vale, just the man I wanted to see. Let me buy you a whiskey. No business, just a friendly drink between neighbors." Jonah had no desire to drink with this man. "I'm not thirsty." Pike's smile didn't falter. He fell into step beside Jonah as he walked toward his horse. "A man has to look to the future. This town is growing. The railroad is coming. Progress. Jonah, it's a powerful tide. You can either ride it or be drowned by it." He paused, letting the words sink in. Some land is worth more for what's under it, or what can go over it, than what can be grazed on top of it. Any land has its price, if the buyer is motivated enough. Jonah stopped, turning to face Pike fully. The setting sun cast long shadows down the street, and, for a moment, Jonah's shadow fell over the banker, eclipsing him. "My land isn't for sale. Pike!" He mounted Boulder and rode out of town, the banker's veiled words clinging to him like spider webs. He knew it wasn't an offer. It was a threat. The moon was a sliver in the sky that night, offering little light. The coyotes were yipping in the hills, a lonely, wild sound. At the far eastern edge of the Red Kestrel Ranch, where the grassland began to soften into the marshy terrain of the Sweetwater, a figure moved through the tall reeds. He worked quickly and silently. He pulled a wooden stake from a canvas bag. It was a surveyor's stake, about 3 feet long. Its top 4 inches painted a stark, shocking red. He found a spot where the ground was solid, took a small sledgehammer from his belt, and with a series of muffled, heavy thuds, drove the stake deep into Jonah Vale's land. It stood in the darkness like a single drop of blood, a silent claim, a promise of the trouble to come. The scar started just below his left shoulder blade and ran diagonally across his back, a long, silvered welt that ended above his right hip. It was a river of ruined flesh, a map of a single, terrible moment. At dusk, Jonah would stand by the wash basin outside his small ranch house, the water cold from the well, and sluice the day's grime from his body. The water traced the scar's path, the puckered skin different to the touch, smoother and yet harder than the rest of him. It never hurt, not anymore, but it never let him forget. The water, that's what brought it back. The sound of it splashing in the basin, the cold shock on his skin. The sky was the color of a bad bruise. Rain falling for 3 days. Not hard, just a miserable, endless weeping from the heavens. The creek wasn't a creek anymore. It was a muddy, churning beast, eating its own banks. He and Caleb, just 17 then, all lanky arms and a laugh that was too loud for his body, were trying to brace the fence along the lower pasture. The water was already up to their knees, cold enough to ache in their bones. "She's gonna go," Jonah Caleb had yelled over the roar. The water sounded like a train, a constant, grinding thunder. He had grabbed Caleb's arm. "We're done. Let's go." But the big cottonwood at the bend of the creek had groaned, a deep, sickening sound of wood giving up its ghost. It leaned, slow at first, then fell with a crack that ripped through the storm's noise. It didn't just fall. It took a whole section of the bank with it, and the fence, and the world gave way to a wall of brown water, logs, and mud. A flash flood, a liquid avalanche. He remembered being thrown, tumbling, the water trying to force its way into his lungs. He surfaced, gasping, grabbing for a purchase that wasn't there. He saw Caleb, just for a second, pinned against the fallen trunk of the cottonwood, his eyes wide with surprise. Not fear, not yet. Then a tangle of fence posts and barbed wire, swept along by the current, slammed into Jonah's back, tearing through his shirt and skin. The pain was white-hot, electric. It stole his breath. By the time he could see again through the searing agony, Caleb was gone. The water had taken him. Jonah straightened up from the basin, the present-day silence of the ranch rushing back in. The memory receded, leaving the familiar hollow ache in his chest. He dried himself with a rough cloth, the fabric snagging on the old scar. He pulled on a clean shirt. The house was quiet. Too quiet. It always had been since that day. He went into the attached storeroom, the air thick with the smell of leather, grain, and dust. He needed a new coil of rope. His hand brushed against a small wooden crate tucked away on a high shelf, under a pile of old blankets. He stopped. He reached up, his movements slow, and pulled the crate down. He blew a layer of dust from the lid and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded newspaper, was a pair of boys' work boots. They were small, the leather scuffed at the toes and worn smooth at the heels. One of the laces was broken, tied together in a clumsy knot. Caleb's boots, the last pair he'd owned. Jonah ran a calloused thumb over the cracked leather. He didn't say anything. He never did. There were no words for this kind of apology, this quiet, suffocating guilt that lived in a wooden box on a dusty shelf. He closed the lid gently, put the crate back in its place, and took his coil of rope. The silence was his penance. Lila Rowan, meanwhile, worked in a world of sharp, clean smells. In her small clinic, she used a mortar and pestle, her wrist moving in a steady, circular motion, grinding dried mint leaves into a fine powder. She added a drop of pine oil, then another, the scents rising to fill the small space. Her movements were precise, economical. She was a woman who believed in order, in cause and effect, in the body's simple, brutal logic of injury and healing. She also believed in the evidence of her own eyes, and what she had seen and heard in Sagebrush Crossing didn't add up. The red stake on Vale's land, the pressure from Pike, the rumors of the railroad. It felt like a game of checkers where someone was moving pieces in the dark. She saw Jonah later that week when he came into town for supplies. She was wrapping a fresh bandage on her own ankle, the sprain slowly mending. When he walked past the open door of her clinic, she made a decision. "Mr. Vale," she called out, her voice clear and direct. He stopped, turning. He looked as if he were expecting a summons, not a conversation. "I have a question for you, if you have a moment." She gestured with her head toward the bench outside. "It's about the Sweetwater Marsh." He hesitated, his instinct to retreat warring with a flicker of curiosity in his pale eyes. He gave a short nod and waited. She got straight to the point. "I've been hearing talk. They say the ground there is unstable, that the water levels shift." "They do," he said, his voice low. "But not like this year. It's high, too high for a dry season." Lila watched his face. He was giving her facts, not opinions. Any idea why a muscle worked in his jaw? He looked out past the town, toward the hazy line of hills that marked his land. Someone's been clearing the reeds along the eastern edge, where it borders my pasture." He paused. "They're burning them, but the ground is wet," Lila countered. "The reeds won't burn." "They don't want a wildfire," Jonah said, a grim understanding dawning in his eyes as he spoke the words aloud. "They burn it in patches. The wet reeds just smolder for days, kills them down to the root, clears a path, and all that smoke makes it look like the whole marsh is on fire. Worthless. Dangerous." Lila's mind worked quickly, fitting the pieces together, clearing a path for surveyors and making the land seem hazardous to drive down the price, she mused. Almost to herself, she looked at him. "You found that red stake, didn't you?" He just nodded, his eyes telling her everything. He understood the game now, too. He understood the stake was not a marker, but a weapon. That night, the attack came not with water, but with fire. Jonah was woken not by a sound, but by a change in the light. A faint, unnatural orange flickered against his bedroom window. He was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his boots, his senses screaming. The smell hit him, then acrid smoke. Burning hay. The cattle barn. He burst out of the house. A corner of the large barn was engulfed in flames. The fire was climbing the dry wooden walls, eating its way toward the hayloft. Inside, he could hear the terrified, high-pitched bleating of the new calves he'd separated into a pen there. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy axe from beside the door and ran, plunging into the thick, choking smoke. The heat was a physical blow. The air burned his lungs. Through the swirling blackness, he could see the calves, huddled together in the far corner, paralyzed with fear. The flames were between him and them, feeding on a stack of loose hay. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway behind him. It was Lila. She must have been riding out from town, perhaps to check on him, and had seen the glow. Her face was a pale oval in the fiery light. She didn't scream or panic. Her eyes took in the scene in a fraction of a second. She ran to the large water trough, grabbed his heavy duster that was hanging on a peg, and plunged it into the water. She reappeared, dragging the soaking, heavy coat, and threw it with all her strength over the main section of the burning hay. The fire hissed and spat, a cloud of steam and smoke erupting. Momentarily beating back the flames, it was the chance he needed. Jonah chopped through the wooden pen, the axe blows echoing in the roar of the fire. "Hiya, get," he yelled, his voice raw, pushing the terrified animals toward the opening she had made. They stumbled out into the night air, their coats singed. A burning beam overhead cracked and splintered. Jonah shoved the last calf clear just as it fell, a piece of it catching his shoulder, tearing his shirt and the skin beneath. He ignored the pain, his focus absolute. He and Lila worked in the choking darkness, a desperate, silent team, until the last animal was safe. They stumbled out into the yard, collapsing to their knees, gasping for air. The fire had been contained to the one corner, and without the hay to feed it, it was already dying down, leaving a smoldering, black wound in the side of the barn. He looked at her. Soot streaked her face. Her sleeves were blackened. Her hair had come undone. He had a long, bleeding gash on his shoulder. Salt sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes. They had won, but the message had been sent. Inside the small, clean ranch house, the air still smelled of smoke. A single lantern cast a warm glow over the simple wooden table. Lila cleaned the gash on his shoulder with carbolic acid. Her touch was firm, professional. He sat rigidly on a stool, his back to her, looking at the far wall. "I'll need to stitch this," she said quietly. "It's deep." He gave a slight nod. She worked by lantern light, her movements deft and sure. She threaded a curved suture needle. "This will sting," she said. He stared at the patterns in the wood grain of the wall, his jaw tight. He didn't flinch as the needle pierced his skin. He didn't make a sound. The only noise in the room was the quiet hiss of his own breath, the whisper of the thread passing through his flesh, and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. She was mending his body, but she knew the wound was deeper than skin. It was a violation of his home, his life, his solitude. When she was done, she tied off the last stitch and bandaged the wound. As she was cleaning her instruments, packing them away, a shadow fell across the open doorway. Neither of them had noticed anyone approaching. A man stood there, just outside the square of lantern light, a silhouette against the dark. They couldn't see his face, but they could see the small, glowing red circle near where his mouth would be, the tip of a lit cigar. It brightened as he took a long, slow drag. It hung in the darkness like the eye of some patient, night-hunting animal. He stood there for a full 10 seconds, watching them, letting them feel his presence. Then, as silently as he appeared, he was gone, leaving only the faint, expensive scent of tobacco smoke to drift into the room. The heat of the day had settled over the valley like a smothering blanket, thick and still. It was the kind of heat that baked the earth into a cracked, pale plate and made the air shimmer above the sagebrush. In the back of Jonah's buckboard wagon, a small child lay on a bed of hastily gathered blankets. Her name was Sarah Miller, and she was 7 years old. Her skin, usually tan from a life under the sun, had a pale, waxy yellow tint to it. A violent shivering racked her small frame, a stark contrast to the sweat that beaded on her brow. Malaria, the marsh fever. It rose from the stagnant waters of the Sweetwater every summer, an invisible miasma that sought out the vulnerable. Lila Rowan sat on the wagon bed beside the girl, dipping a cloth into a bucket of lukewarm water and gently bathing her face. The child's eyes, when they opened, were too bright, glazed with a feverish intensity that saw things that weren't there. Lila's face was a mask of concentration, her movements calm and reassuring. But inside, a cold urgency propelled her. The quinine she had was a temporary measure. The child needed constant care, a cool room, and more medicine than Lila carried in her traveling bag. She needed to get back to the clinic in Sagebrush Crossing. Jonah sat on the driver's bench, his back straight, his hands holding the leather reins with a steady, practiced grip. He hadn't said more than a dozen words since he'd arrived at the Miller homestead, a desperate summons from Sarah's father having reached him at dawn. He had simply hitched his team to the buckboard, loaded the child, and waited for Lila, who had been called out at the same time. Now he drove, his pale eyes scanning the rutted track ahead, his jaw set. He was a man who moved when motion was required and was still when it was not. He was the opposite of the frantic, terrified energy radiating from the child's parents, who had stayed behind, their faces etched with a helplessness that was agonizing to watch. The road was barely a road, 2 deep ruts carved into the hard-packed earth. The wagon jolted and swayed, each bump and dip of the wheels sending a fresh wave of shivers through the sick child and a sympathetic wince across Lila's face. She braced herself with one hand against the side of the wagon, her other never ceasing its gentle, cooling ministrations. They were making for the Cotton Trace Bridge, a shortcut that would save them nearly an hour. The bridge was old, a skeleton of sun-bleached timbers spanning a deep, rocky arroyo that was bone dry this time of year. It was known to be unreliable, a patchwork of repairs and hopeful carpentry. But with the child's fever climbing, it was a risk they had to take. As the horse's hooves clattered onto the first wooden planks, the entire structure seemed to groan in protest. The timbers rattled, and the wagon swayed more violently. Jonah kept the team at a steady, slow walk, his body tense, listening to the sounds of the bridge as much as feeling them. They were halfway across when it happened. There was a sharp sound, like a pistol shot, as a rotten support plank directly under the right front wheel snapped in two. The wheel dropped a good 8 inches with a violent, bone-jarring lurch. The entire wagon pitched sideways. The bucket of water overturned, sloshing across the wagon bed. Sarah cried out, a thin, reedy sound of terror. Lila was thrown off balance. She had been leaning over the child, and the sudden, violent motion sent her stumbling sideways. Her foot slipped off the edge of the wagon bed. She reached out instinctively to catch herself, her hand slamming against the wagon's side rail, but her momentum was too great. She went over the side, her other foot tangling in the blankets. Jonah moved. He was a blur of action, his body reacting before his mind could form a thought. He dropped the reins and launched himself from the driver's bench, not onto the bridge, but into the wagon bed itself. He landed in a crouch as Lila's body was about to tumble into the rocky arroyo below. His arm shot out, his hand clamping around her upper arm like an iron band, arresting her fall. She dangled there for a heart-stopping moment, half in and half out of the wagon, her feet scrabbling for a purchase that wasn't there. And then came the second sound, a sound far more sickening than the cracking of wood. As her full weight came to bear on her outstretched left arm, the one still braced against the side rail, her wrist gave way. It wasn't a loud sound, but in the sudden, ringing silence after the wagon's crash, it was hideously clear. A dry, sickening crack, pain, white and absolute, exploded behind Lila's eyes. It was a clean, sharp agony that stole her breath and made the world dissolve into a gray, swimming haze. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. Her body went limp, all the fight draining out of her. Jonah hauled her back into the wagon with a single powerful pull. He held her, his arm still locked around hers, his other hand steadying her as she slumped against him. Her head fell forward, her face chalky white beneath the streaks of dust and grime. Her breath was coming in short, sharp hitches, from the saloon at the edge of town, not 50 yards from the bridge entrance. A few men had wandered out for a smoke. They had seen the wagon lurch, had seen the woman almost fall. They watched now, idle and curious. Lila forced her head up. Her eyes were clouded with pain, but a fierce, desperate light burned in their depths. She looked at Jonah, then at her own left arm, which was bent at an unnatural angle. She knew, with a cold, clinical certainty, that both bones in her forearm were broken. "Jonah!" she gasped, the name a raw whisper. She bit her lip, fighting back a wave of nausea. She knew she had to be moved, and she knew it had to be done correctly. To prevent the sharp ends of the broken bones from doing more damage, she needed to be laid flat, her shoulder and back immobilized. There was no room for gentleness or hesitation. It required a firm, decisive, and purposeful action. She looked at him, her eyes pleading, commanding. Through teeth clenched so tight her jaw ached, she forced the words out, each one a shard of glass. "Lay me down, like you mean it." The words, raw with pain and urgency, carried across the still air. To the men watching from the saloon's porch, their minds slow with whiskey and idleness, the phrase landed with a completely different meaning. It was intimate, demanding, a line from a dime novel whispered in the heat of passion. A slow, greasy grin spread across one man's face. He nudged his companion. "Well, now," he drawled, his voice a low, carrying chuckle. "Hear that the quiet one's got fire in him after all." Another man laughed. A short, ugly bark. "Like he means it," he repeated, savoring the words. "Reckon Vale knows how to handle more than just his cattle." Their hollow laughter drifted across the arroyo, a squalid sound that desecrated the raw, silent tension on the bridge. Jonah heard them. He saw them. He gave them no more notice than he would a pair of circling buzzards. His attention was entirely on the woman in his arms. He looked into her eyes, and he understood. He did not hear a lover's plea. He heard a doctor's precise, desperate instruction. He saw the cold, hard logic born of her agony. He gave a single, curt nod. His movements became deliberate, almost mechanical. He didn't cradle her or try to soothe her. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, taking her full weight. He rose to his feet, his footing sure on the tilted wagon bed. He looked around, his eyes assessing the situation. The broken section of the bridge was impassable, but a long, thick plank running alongside it was still intact. It was flat. It was stable. He stepped carefully onto the plank. He bent from his knees, keeping his back straight, and laid her down. The movement was not gentle. It was firm, decisive, and utterly without hesitation. He placed her on the hard wood with a solidity that jolted her, but it was exactly what she needed. He positioned her body in a straight line, carefully aligning her shoulders and hips. He had laid her down exactly as she had meant it for a purpose. with unwavering intent. He straightened up, his face an unreadable mask. He turned back to the wagon. He gently lifted the sick, whimpering child into his arms and carried her across the stable plank to where Lila lay. He then went back, unhitched the terrified horses, and led them, one by one, across to safety. The broken wagon. He left where it was. Lila, lying on her back, directed him with her eyes and small movements of her chin, a nod toward the town, a slight tilt of her head indicating the path. He understood each silent command. He gently placed Sarah Miller on the ground beside Lila, then scooped Lila into his arms again. He carried her, with the child walking unsteadily beside him, the remaining distance into Sagebrush Crossing. He didn't look at the men on the saloon porch as he passed. He simply walked, his stride long and purposeful, a silent man on a desperate errand. In the clean, quiet space of her clinic, he placed her on the cot. The world outside, with its leering jokes and whispers, ceased to exist. There was only the small room, the smell of carbolic acid, and the sharp, white reality of her pain. She gestured with her chin toward a drawer. "The laudanum," she whispered. Then, to a small chest, splints, bandages, and finally, to a hook on the wall. "My handkerchief." He brought them to her without a word. He uncorked the bottle of laudanum, but she shook her head. "For the child." She took the worn cotton handkerchief, the one with the faded JV, embroidered in the corner, and placed it between her teeth. She took a deep, shuddering breath and looked at her own grotesquely swollen wrist. Then she looked at Jonah. "Hold my shoulder," she commanded, her voice muffled by the cloth. "Don't let me move." He knelt beside the cot. He placed his large, calloused hand on her right shoulder. His grip wasn't gentle. It was immovable. It was an anchor. Lila closed her eyes. With her good hand, she took hold of her broken one. There was a sickening, grating sound of bone moving against bone. A strangled cry was torn from her throat, muffled by the handkerchief. Her entire body arched in a spasm of pure, clean agony. Jonah's hand never wavered. He held her firm, his eyes never leaving her face, his expression grim. He was a witness to her courage, to this terrible, necessary act of violence she was performing on herself. A thin sheen of sweat broke out on her forehead. She gasped, her knuckles white as she completed the task. The bones were set. The immediate, sharp agony subsided into a deep, throbbing ache. She spat the handkerchief out, her breath coming in ragged sobs of relief. Just outside the open door, on the shaded boardwalk, Luther Pike stood watching. He had seen Jonah carry her in. He had seen the grim procession. He wasn't smiling. Not quite. But the look on his face was one of keen, calculating interest. His lips were pressed into a thin line, a look of appraisal, as if he were watching two chess pieces move into an unexpected but potentially advantageous position on the board. He saw not a man helping an injured woman, but a partnership being forged in crisis, an alliance solidifying. And he wondered, his coyote quick eyes missing nothing, how he might be able to break it. Lila's breathing began to even out. The worst was over. She lay back, exhausted, her good hand resting on the small, shivering form of Sarah Miller, who had fallen into a feverish sleep on a blanket on the floor. Jonah slowly removed his hand from her shoulder. He stood up, his tall frame filling the small room. He looked down at her, at the soot-streaked, pain-etched face that was still, somehow, fiercely undefeated. He didn't have the words to say what he was feeling, the respect, the awe at her fortitude. Words were clumsy, inadequate things, so he simply reached up and took off his hat, holding the dusty, sweat-stained brim in both hands. He stood for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate bow of his head. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken gratitude. It was an apology. It was an acknowledgement of a shared ordeal, a debt that could never be repaid in coin. Then he placed his hat back on his head and went to tend to the horses. Pain is a meticulous teacher. It had taught Lila Rowan the intricate geography of her own bones, the precise location of every nerve that screamed in protest. Now, with her left arm bound tightly in a splint and cradled in a sling, Her world had shrunk to the things she could accomplish with one hand. But while her body was limited, her mind, sharpened by the throbbing ache in her wrist, had never been more focused. It sifted through details, searching for patterns, for the single loose thread that, if pulled, could unravel the whole ugly tapestry being woven around Jonah Vale. The thread appeared in the form of a man named Jedediah, Jed Stone, a hulking, silent figure who was never far from Luther Pike's side. He was Pike's shadow, his muscle, the physical manifestation of the banker's unspoken threats. Jed walked into Lila's clinic 2 days after the incident at the bridge. Not for himself, but to buy a bottle of liniment for Pike's carriage horse. As he stood impatiently by the counter, Lila's observant eyes were drawn to his boots. They were caked in mud. This in itself was not unusual in a town like Sagebrush Crossing. But this mud was different. It wasn't the common dusty brown of the main street or the dark, loamy soil of the ranches. It was a peculiar shade of reddish-brown, shot through with streaks of gray clay. It clung to the leather in thick, sticky patches. Lila had seen that mud before, but only in one place. During her first weeks in the territory, she had accompanied a prospector, a man addled with fever, on a trek near the edge of the Sweetwater Marsh, searching for medicinal herbs. He had warned her about the red bogs, treacherous patches of ground where the iron-rich soil created a sucking mire that could pull a horse down. No one goes in there. Doc, he'd said, no reason to. Yet here was the proof, drying on Jed Stone's boots. A man who worked for Luther Pike had been deep inside the supposedly impassable marsh. That mud looks hard to get off, Lila said conversationally as she handed him the bottle. Jed grunted, his eyes flat and incurious. Just mud. He threw the coins on the counter and left, leaving a few clods of the reddish-brown earth on her clean floor. Lila knelt, her good hand carefully scooping a small sample of the dried mud into an empty specimen envelope. It was a small thing, a speck of dirt, but it felt as solid as a signed confession. That afternoon, she walked to the county clerk's office, a cramped room smelling of dust and aging paper in the back of the land office. The clerk, a man named Peters with a green eyeshade and ink-stained fingers, was a creature of routine. He looked up, surprised to have a visitor. I was hoping I might look at a geological survey map of the area, Lila said, her voice polite and professional. I'm cataloging local plant life for medicinal purposes. Understanding the soil composition would be a great help. Peters, pleased by the scientific nature of the request, was happy to oblige. He unrolled a large, crackling map across a wide table. It was a beautiful, hand-drawn document, detailing the topography of the county in elegant lines and shaded contours. Lila found what she was looking for, the Sweetwater Marsh, depicted as a large, amorphous green splotch, with a practiced eye. She traced the network of small creeks and streams that fed into it from the foothills. Then, taking a small pencil from her bag, she began to make a series of tiny, almost invisible marks on the map, cross-referencing them with the information she'd coaxed from Jonah about the strange flooding on his land. Her marks showed a pattern, a series of blockages, unnatural choke points, precisely where the water flow into the marsh could be artificially raised to flood the bordering pasture land. While Lila was fighting her war with maps and mud, Jonah was fighting his on the ground. The burned section of his barn was a constant, gaping reminder of his vulnerability. He knew the fire was a message, just like the red stake. He rode the eastern fence line again, his rifle resting easy across his saddle horn, his eyes scanning not for stray cattle, but for signs of men. He found it near the spot where the stake had been, tucked deep inside a thicket of reeds that had been spared from the burning. He smelled it first, the sharp, chemical tang of lamp oil. It was a smell that didn't belong in the natural, earthy scent of the marsh. He dismounted, pushing his way through the dense cattails. There it was, a half-empty barrel of oil, clumsily hidden. The ground around it was saturated, the reddish mud stained black. A slow, steady drip oozed from a loose bung, the source of the smell. It was cheap, low-grade oil, the kind used for lamps and for starting stubborn fires in wet conditions. He now knew how they had managed to burn the damp reeds. He was about to leave when his boot caught on something hard under the mud. He knelt, digging with his gloved hands, and pulled out another one of the red-topped stakes. This one had a number crudely painted on it, 27. He remembered the first stake, the one he'd pulled from the ground a week ago. He'd thrown it in his buckboard and forgotten about it. He rode back to the ranch house and retrieved it. It was marked with the number 26. These weren't random markers. They were numbered. They were part of a sequence. The next day, Jonah met Lila in town. They stood behind the blacksmith shop, the clang of the hammer providing a noisy cover for their quiet, urgent conversation. He told her about the oil and the numbered stakes. Her eyes lit up with a cold, intellectual fire. Numbers, she said, more to herself than to him. Numbered lots. She pulled the geological map from her satchel. Let's go back to the clerk's office. I want to see the plat records for upcoming land auctions. They found it pinned to a public notice board. The county was auctioning off several parcels of land seized for back taxes. The parcels were listed by number. Lot 26 and Lot 27, described as unusable marshland, were on the list for next month. The opening bids were insultingly low. Someone was systematically marking out the land, devaluing it with fire and flood, all to acquire it for pennies on the dollar at a public auction. And the newly marked path for the railroad ran straight through those lots. That evening, Lila walked into the saloon. Her arm was still in its sling, a visible symbol of the town's recent violence. The room went quiet for a moment. A woman like her didn't belong there. She ignored the stairs and walked directly to the table in the back where Luther Pike was playing cards with the railroad foreman. A loud, beefy man named Cormac. Jed Stone stood behind Pike's chair like a statue. Lila placed her good hand flat on their table. The card game stopped. "Mr. Pike," she said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the smoky air. "A question for you. Is it more profitable to burn reeds with oil before or after you get the county to list the land for auction?" Cormac, the foreman, sputtered on his whiskey. Pike, however, did not flinch. He slowly placed his cards face down on the table and looked up at her, a look of amused contempt in his eyes. He smiled his thin, bloodless smile. "Miss Rowan, you have a vivid imagination. I'm a banker. I deal in facts and figures, not in fanciful stories about fires and swamps." He leaned back in his chair, projecting an aura of untouchable confidence. "You're making a serious accusation. Where is your proof?" His question was a challenge, thrown down in front of half the town. He knew she had nothing but speculation. The laughter started, low and scattered at first, then growing louder, at the expense of the one-armed doctor trying to take on the most powerful man in town. "Proof has a way of turning up," Lila said, her gaze unwavering. She turned and walked out, her head held high, the sound of their laughter following her into the street. But she had planted a seed of unease. Later, as Cormac was leaving, flushed with whiskey and victory at cards, Jonah intercepted him by the livery stable. Cormac was boasting to one of the stable hands. "Pike drives a hard bargain, but he pays his debts." Cormac slurred, puffing out his chest. "That bonus for clearing the marsh ahead of schedule is as good as in my pocket." Jonah stepped out of the shadows. "What bonus was that?" "Cormac." The foreman's face went pale. He saw the cold, quiet anger in Jonah's eyes, and his drunken bravado evaporated. That's railroad business. None of yours. You've been burning my borderlands. That makes it my business," Jonah said, his voice a low growl. He noticed a leather-bound ledger sticking out of Cormac's coat pocket. "What's in the book?" "Nothing." Cormac clutched at his coat, trying to shield the ledger. "Company accounts." Jonah didn't waste any more words. He moved, his speed deceptive. He grabbed Cormac's coat, not to strike him, but to pin him against the stable wall. Cormac thrashed, a clumsy, panicked movement. Jonah simply used the man's own momentum against him, twisting him around. The ledger fell from his pocket, landing in the dusty straw at their feet. Jonah released him, stooped, and picked up the book in one fluid motion. Cormac scrambled to his feet, his face a mixture of fear and fury. "You can't do that. That's private property." Jonah just looked at him, the ledger held firmly in his hand. Cormac saw the look on Vale's face and knew a physical fight was a losing proposition. He sputtered another threat, then turned and stomped away into the darkness. A man defeated not by a punch, but by a quiet, unbreakable resolve. Later, in the warm glow of the lantern in Lila's clinic, they opened the book. Most of it was legitimate accounts wages, feed costs, lumber prices. But in the back, there was a separate section, written in a smaller, more careful hand. The heading was Asset Protection. It was a list of payments, dates, and initials. There were entries for oil and transport. There were several payments listed next to the initials J.S., Jed Stone, and one entry, dated the day of the stagecoach accident, Red Bridge Maintenance, payment to J.S. Lila traced the entry with her finger. The man who loosened the wheel on the coach. It was Jed Stone. Jonah nodded, his face grim. To stop you, or scare you away. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the small book heavy in the room. They had it, the mud, the map, the oil, the stakes, the ledger. They had the proof Pike had demanded. Lila looked up at Jonah, her eyes dark with the seriousness of their next move. "This ledger is proof," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But it's just a book. It's worthless without a law to back it up." "And there is no law here." "Jonah, not if the community doesn't stand up and make it the law." She was right. They could take this to the magistrate, Judge Hollis, but it would be their word. And this book, against the power and influence of Luther Pike. Pike owned the debt of half the men in town. He could crush them with rumor and intimidation. They would only win if others were willing to stand with them. Jonah looked from the ledger to Lila's determined face, to the sling that held her broken arm. He had spent his life in solitude, asking for nothing, relying on no one. He preferred the silent company of his cattle to the complicated world of men. But that world had come for him. It had burned his barn, threatened his land, and hurt this woman who had, for reasons he didn't fully understand, stood by his side. The time for silence was over. He reached out and closed the ledger with a soft thud. He nodded his head. A single, resolute gesture. The decision was made. They would go to the judge. They would stand up. Together. The moon was a sickle, a sliver of bone-white light hanging in an ink-black sky. It offered no comfort, only just enough light to turn the familiar landscape into a place of menacing shapes and deep, unknowable shadows. Along the edge of the Sweetwater Marsh, 2 horses galloped, their hooves sucking at the soft, damp earth. Their breaths came in ragged, steaming bursts in the cool night air. Jonah Vale rode bolder, his body low over the horse's neck, the precious ledger tucked securely inside his coat, its sharp corners digging into his ribs with every stride. Beside him, Lila Rowan rode a steady mare borrowed from the livery, her one good hand holding the reins, her splinted arm a pale slash against the dark fabric of her dress. They were not riding. They were fleeing. Behind them, maybe 100 yards back, 3 other riders pushed their horses hard in pursuit. They were dark shapes, faceless men with bandanas pulled high over their noses, their intent made clear by the intermittent crack of a rifle and the angry whine of a bullet slicing through the air nearby. These were Pike's men, the shadows from the saloon, sent to reclaim the one piece of evidence that could bring their master's world crashing down. The terrain was treacherous. To their left was the open grassland, a moonlit killing field with no cover. To their right was the marsh itself, a maze of tall reeds, black water, and sucking mud. The path they followed was a narrow, winding track used by animals, a tightrope between 2 kinds of death. "They're gaining," Lila shouted, her voice strained, nearly stolen by the wind of their passage. Jonah didn't need to be told. He could hear the drumming of the hooves behind them growing louder, more distinct. He scanned the landscape ahead, his mind racing, looking for an advantage, a way to turn the land itself into a weapon. He saw at a place where a floating mass of cut reeds and cattails, a natural raft created by the shifting currents, was tethered to the bank by a thick, gnarled root. "Here!" he yelled, pulling Boulder to a sharp, skidding turn. "Follow me!" He veered off the path, guiding his horse into the marsh itself. The water was shallow here, only up to the horse's knees, but the mud below was thick and greedy. The horses strained, their movements slowing dramatically. Lila followed without hesitation, her trust in him absolute. Their pursuers, seeing them enter the marsh, let out a triumphant yell, thinking their prey was now trapped. Jonah leapt from his saddle into the cold, murky water. He pulled the heavy hunting knife from the sheath on his belt. "Keep the horses moving," he ordered Lila. He waded through the chest-high water to the tangled root holding the reed raft. He began to hack at it, the thick, wet fibers resisting the blade. The water swirled around him, cold and black. Behind him, the first of their pursuers entered the marsh. A shot rang out, much closer this time, and the water erupted in a splash just inches from Jonah's head. He ignored it, his focus narrowed to the task, his arms straining with each desperate blow of the knife. With a final, tearing sound, the root gave way. The large, tangled raft of reeds, 20 feet across, swung free. Pushed by the slow, inexorable current of the marsh, it began to drift out, a floating wall of vegetation, blocking the narrow channel they had just passed through. Their pursuers were cut off, forced to find a way around, buying Jonah and Lila precious seconds. Jonah slogged back to his horse and hauled himself into the saddle. "Go!" he urged, and they pushed their struggling mounts back toward the solid ground of the path. But the men were not so easily deterred. 2 of them began firing into the reed raft, hoping a stray bullet might find its mark. The third, a burly man on a powerful black horse, spurred his mount along the bank, seeking a place to cross. "The lantern," Jonah yelled to Lila, pointing to the small storm lantern tied to her saddle. It was still lit, a tiny beacon of orange light in the vast darkness. Lila understood instantly. With her one good hand, she fumbled with the knot, her fingers clumsy with cold and urgency. She finally tore it free. "Now!" she cried. Jonah was watching the man on the black horse. He had found a narrow spot and was urging his animal across. "Now!" Lila swung the lantern in a wide arc, building momentum, and then she threw it. It sailed through the air, a small comet, not at the man, but at the ground just in front of him. It shattered on the oily, reed-choked mud where Jonah had found the leaking barrel of oil days before. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The spilled kerosene ignited with a soft whoomp. It didn't explode into a wall of flame. The mud was too wet for that. Instead, the oil-saturated ground began to smolder and burn, releasing a thick, acrid, impenetrable cloud of black smoke. It rolled across the water, a choking, blinding curtain that completely obscured the riders. Curses and panicked shouts erupted from within the smoke as the man on the black horse was forced to pull back, his animal rearing in terror. They had a lead. They broke from the marsh and galloped hard, pushing the horses to their limits. The path widened, leading up a gentle rise toward the old wooden bridge that spanned the deepest part of the marsh, the same bridge where the overland coach had crashed. It felt like a lifetime ago. They were almost there, almost to the safety of the bridge and the open road to town, when the third rider burst from the smoke behind them. It was Jed Stone. He must have held back, letting the others charge ahead. His face was a grim mask of fury, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He was faster, his horse fresher, and he was closing the distance with terrifying speed. He drew a heavy pistol as he rode. He wasn't aiming for a long-distance shot. He was coming for the ledger. Jonah saw him coming. He knew they wouldn't both make it to the bridge in time. "Lila, ride on, don't stop," he commanded. He pulled back on Boulder's reins, turning to face their pursuer, placing himself between Jed and Lila. Jed bore down on him. Jonah urged Boulder forward to meet the charge, intending to use his horse's weight to unseat the larger man, but as he spurred the roan, its hoof slipped on a patch of wet clay. The horse stumbled, going down on one knee with a pained grunt. The sudden lurch threw Jonah from the saddle. He landed hard, the air knocked from his lungs. his body slamming against the ground at the very foot of the bridge. He tried to push himself up, his head swimming, but his right hand came down on something sharp. A piece of iron, an old railroad spike, or a piece of broken farming equipment, lay half buried in the mud. The sharp, rusted point pierced the palm of his hand, and a hot, searing pain shot up his arm. Blood, dark in the moonlight, welled up from the wound. Jed Stone was on him in an instant. He leaped from his horse, his massive frame blotting out the moon. He raised his pistol, not to shoot, but to use it as a club, to bring the heavy iron barrel crashing down on Jonah's skull. Jonah was still on his knees, stunned, his vision blurred. He was defenseless. "No!" A cry, fierce and desperate, cut through the night. Lila had not ridden on. She had turned back. She threw herself from her horse and ran, launching her own small body at the hulking man. She slammed into him, not with enough force to knock him down, but enough to spoil his aim. The pistol barrel came down, but instead of hitting Jonah's head, it glanced off his shoulder with a sickening thud. Lila fell to the ground beside Jonah. She scrambled between him and their attacker, shielding his body with her own. Her back was to Jed Stone, her face inches from Jonah's, her eyes wide and luminous with terror and a wild, defiant courage, stared into his. Her splinted arm was pressed against his chest. "Don't you die here," she breathed, the words of fierce, desperate prayer. "Do you hear me? Jonah Vale. You will not die here." Seeing her, feeling the fragile warmth of her body shielding his, hearing the raw command in her voice, it was like a bucket of ice water to his soul. The haze of pain and shock cleared. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded his veins. Jed Stone shoved her roughly aside, raising the pistol for a second. Final blow. But Jonah was already moving. He surged up from the ground, not to his feet, but in a low, powerful crouch. He drove forward, under the man's swing, slamming his good shoulder into Jed's midsection. The larger man grunted, the air driven from his lungs, and staggered back a step. It was all the opening Jonah needed. He didn't have his pistol. It had been lost in the fall, but his rifle was still slung across his back. He didn't have time to unsling it, to aim and fire. Instead, he reached back, his wounded hand screaming in protest, and gripped the rifle by its barrel. In one fluid, brutal motion, he swung it like a club. The heavy wooden stock of the rifle connected with the side of Jed Stone's head with a dull, wet crack. The man's eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the ground without a sound and lay still. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged, gasping breaths of 2 horses and 2 people. The night air was cold on their sweat-soaked skin. For a moment, they just knelt there in the mud, the unconscious form of their attacker at their feet. Jonah's hand was dripping blood onto the dark earth. He found the coil of rope on Jed's saddle and, with Lila's help, they tightly bound the unconscious man's hands and feet. They left him there, a problem for the magistrate to solve in the morning. Jonah pushed himself to his feet, his whole body aching. He reached inside his coat. The ledger was still there. He pulled it out, holding it as if to reassure himself it was real. They had it. They had won. He helped Lila to her feet. They walked, leading their tired horses, the short distance onto the bridge, and there, in the middle of the wooden expanse, with the black water of the marsh flowing silently below them, the adrenaline finally began to recede. A violent shudder ran through Lila's body. It was not from the cold. It was the aftermath of terror, the body's delayed reaction to the certainty of death averted. Her teeth began to chatter, and another tremor shook her from head to toe. She wrapped her good arm around herself, but it did no good. Jonah saw her trembling. He stepped closer. He was a man of few words and fewer gestures of comfort. He didn't know how to soothe or reassure, but he acted on instinct. He reached out with his good hand, the left one, and gently, carefully, placed it on the back of her neck. His hand was large and warm. His thumb rested just at the base of her skull, his fingers curling lightly into her hair. It was not a lover's caress. It was an anchor, a point of stillness in a shaking world. A simple, solid gesture that said, "I am here. You are safe. Be still." Under the steady, warm pressure of his hand. Her trembling slowly subsided. Her breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, began to deepen. The wild hammering of her heart began to slow. The marsh grew quiet around them. The frantic sounds of the chase faded, replaced by the gentle chirping of crickets and the deep, resonant croak of a bullfrog. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, shrouded in the quiet intimacy of the night. They were so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. So close he could smell the faint, clean scent of lavender that clung to her clothes, a scent that cut through the metallic tang of blood and the swampy odor of the marsh. They stood so close that in the profound stillness that followed the violence, he could hear the steady, rhythmic beat of her heart. Or maybe, he realized, it was his own. Sagebrush Crossing did not have a courthouse. Justice, when it was formally dispensed, was handled in the church. It was the only building in town with pews enough to hold a crowd and a raised pulpit from which a man could speak with authority. On this day, the building was not a house of God, but a court of man, and the air was thick not with piety, but with a tense, simmering expectation. The room smelled of old pine resin from the pews, floor dust, and the faint, lingering scent of last Sunday's beeswax candles. Sunlight, fractured by the cheap, wavy glass of the tall windows, threw long, distorted rectangles of light across the floorboards. At the front, seated behind the simple wooden pulpit, was Judge Thaddeus Hollis. He was a circuit judge, a man whose face was a roadmap of long, lonely miles, and whose eyes had seen every shade of human desperation and greed. He was lean, hawk-nosed, and had a reputation for being as unmovable as the granite foothills. He looked out over the assembled faces, his expression grim. The church was full. Nearly the entire town was there, their usual chores abandoned, drawn by the promise of a confrontation that had been brewing for months. Lila Rowan and Jonah Vale sat on the front pew to the left. On the right sat Luther Pike, flanked by his lawyer, a slick man from back east, and two new faces, hard-eyed men with guns tied low on their hips who watched the crowd with a predator's stillness. Judge Hollis banged a heavy wooden gavel on the pulpit. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "This is an informal hearing," he announced, his voice a dry rasp that carried to the back of the church. "Not a trial. I'm here to hear a grievance and determine if a formal inquiry by the territorial marshal is warranted. Miss Rowan, Mr. Vale, you brought the complaint. You may speak." Lila stood. Her splinted arm, cradled in its dark sling, was a stark piece of evidence before she ever opened her mouth. She did not approach the pulpit. She stood where she was, her voice clear and steady, imbued with a physician's confidence in facts. "Judge Hollis," she began, "we are here because a man's property and life are under systematic attack, and because the law is being used as a weapon to facilitate a crime." She walked to the large table set before the pulpit and, with her one good hand, laid out her evidence with methodical precision. First, she unrolled the geological survey map. This map shows the natural water flow into the Sweetwater Marsh. These pencil marks indicate a series of what I believe to be deliberate, man-made blockages designed to unnaturally flood the adjacent pasture land belonging to Mr. Vale. Next, she placed the small, sealed envelope on the table. This is a sample of reddish clay mud. This type of soil is found only in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the marsh. Yet I collected this sample from the boots of a man in Mr. Pike's employ, Jedediah Stone. Finally, she placed Cormac's leather-bound ledger on the table. She opened it to the pages in the back, and this is a private account ledger belonging to Mr. Cormac, the railroad foreman. It details a series of payments under the heading Asset Protection. Payments for oil. Used to burn Mr. Vale's land. Payments to Mr. Stone for so-called bridge maintenance on the day the overland coach was wrecked, an event which caused my own injuries. And payments for the procurement and placement of numbered survey stakes. She looked directly at Luther Pike, whose face was a mask of bored indifference. "These stakes, Judge, correspond directly to land parcels, Mr. Vale's devalued land, which were subsequently put up for county auction. An auction that would have allowed Mr. Pike in the railroad to acquire the land for a fraction of its true worth. She finished and sat down. A low murmur rippled through the pews. It was a clear, damning narrative. "Mr. Vale," the judge said. His eyes now on Jonah. Jonah stood. He was not a man of speeches. He looked awkward and out of place, his large frame constrained by the church pew. He held his bandaged right hand in his left. He spoke in a low, flat voice. His words clipped, stating facts without embellishment. "There was a fire at my barn. They put red stakes on my land. Last night, Miss Rowan and I were pursued from my ranch by 3 of his men." He gave a slight nod toward Pike. "They shot at us. We were bringing the ledger to you." "Judge, we disarmed one of them. Jed Stone, he's tied up at the sheriff's office now." He stopped, having said all he felt needed to be said. The starkness of his account was more powerful than any flowery oration. Judge Hollis looked at Pike. "Mr. Pike, your response." Pike's lawyer, a man named Sterling, stood up, all smooth confidence. "Judge, this is a fantastical tale, a conspiracy concocted by a debtor and a hysterical woman. Mr. Vale is on the verge of defaulting on a significant loan held by my client." Pike himself then rose, waving his lawyer to be seated. He held up a single, crisp legal document. It was the deed to the Red Kestrel Ranch, held as collateral. "This is the only document that matters in this room." "Judge," Pike said, his voice resonating with oily authority. "This is a contract. Mr. Vale owes my bank a substantial sum of money. The final payment is due in 3 days. He placed the deed on the table next to Lila's evidence, as if to show which held more weight. A debt is a debt. The law is clear. If he cannot pay, the land is mine. All this other business, this talk of mud and fire, is a desperate, pathetic attempt to deflect from his own financial failure." He sat down, crossing his arms, the picture of aggrieved legitimacy. He had turned the entire proceeding back to the cold, hard letter of the law. He knew that in the West, a man's debt was a sacred, ironclad obligation. Judge Hollis was silent for a full minute, his gaze moving from the ledger to the loan agreement, from Jonah's stoic face to Pike's smug one. The town held its breath. Finally, the judge spoke. "There are 2 separate matters here. One is a matter of illegal debt. The other is a matter of serious criminal accusation." He fixed his gaze on Pike. "Mr. Vale's debt is a civil matter, and you are correct, Mr. Pike. It must be honored. However," he paused, letting the word hang in the air, "the evidence presented by Miss Rowan is compelling and deeply troubling. An attempt to deliberately devalue a property in order to seize it is fraud. The use of fire and armed pursuit is attempted murder." He banged his gavel once more. "Therefore, I am issuing 2 orders. First, Deputy Miller will lead a party of men out to the Sweetwater Marsh at dawn tomorrow to investigate Miss Rowan's claims of blockages and to retrieve the numbered stakes. Second, I am ordering a temporary freeze on the accounts listed in this ledger. Mr. Pike, you will surrender all related financial documents from your bank for my personal review. This hearing is suspended until the marsh has been inspected." A collective gasp went through the room. Pike's face, for the first time, lost its composure. A flash of pure fury crossed his features before being replaced by a cold, reptilian stillness. He had been challenged, his power publicly checked. He and his men rose and swept out of the church without another word. As the crowd began to file out, buzzing with the day's events, Jonah and Lila stepped out onto the church porch. The sky had opened up, a gentle, misty rain beginning to fall, washing the dust from the air and turning the main street a dark, rich brown. The rain was a quiet blessing in the dry country. Lila looked up at Jonah, 1,000 emotions swirling inside her relief, fear for what was to come, and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She saw the tension still coiled in his shoulders, the grim set of his jaw. She had an overwhelming urge to reach out, to place her good hand on his wounded one, a simple gesture of shared victory and comfort. But she stopped herself. The space between them was charged, filled with everything they hadn't said, as if sensing her thoughts. Jonah turned his head slightly and looked down at her. His voice was so low she could barely hear it over the soft patter of the rain on the wooden roof. "When this is done," he said, his gaze fixed on the distant hills of his ranch, "when it's all over, I'll say what needs to be said." It wasn't a question. It was a promise of a conversation that would change everything, deferred until they had earned the peace in which to have it. Lila simply nodded, her heart aching with a feeling that was equal parts hope and dread. They were no longer standing alone. A small group of townsfolk approached them on the porch. There was Elias, the store owner, his face full of a new respect. The blacksmith, a burly man whose wife, Martha, had once looked at Lila with such suspicion, now stood beside him, her arms crossed, but with a look of grudging admiration in her eyes. The pastor joined them, his Bible in his hand. "What the judge did was right," the blacksmith said, his voice a low rumble. "That marsh feeds the aquifer that waters all our wells. If Pike is damming it for his own gain, he's stealing from every one of us." Martha nodded in agreement. "And what he did to you, Miss Rowan, and to you, Mr. Vale, that ain't the way of a decent community." A small crowd was forming, a quiet but solid wall of support. They were no longer just Jonah Vale, the lonely rancher, and Lila Rowan, the outsider doctor. They were part of something else. They were the town's conscience, and the town was slowly, tentatively, beginning to stand with them. The first concrete sign of the shifting tide came an hour later. The deputy, emboldened by the judge's orders and the town's mood, formally arrested Cormac, the railroad foreman. They took him from the saloon, his face slack with disbelief. The bonus for clearing the marsh now an impossible dream. Pike saw it all from his bank window. He saw the crowd around Vale and the doctor. He saw his foreman being led to the town's small jail. He was a smart man. He knew he was losing control of the narrative. So he did what cornered, powerful men do. He retreated a step and escalated the threat. He sent a telegraph message. That evening, 2 more strangers rode into town. They were not like the local hard cases Pike usually employed. These men were quiet, their clothes were well made, and their eyes were cold and professional. They were hired guns, brought in from outside, with no ties to the community and no compunctions about what they were asked to do. The stakes of the game had just been raised. That night, Lila was in her clinic, cleaning her instruments by the light of a single lamp. The sick child, Sarah Miller, was finally recovering, sleeping peacefully on the cot. Lila felt a chill, a primal sense of being watched. She went to the door. Someone had taken a knife to the wooden sign she had so carefully lettered. The words "consultation by ability to pay" were still there, but carved over them, in deep, angry gouges, were 2 new words: "Get out." The threat was ugly, personal, and deeply unnerving. It was a violation, a defilement of the small sanctuary she had tried to create. She stood there for a long moment, a wave of cold fear washing over her. For the first time since coming to this hard land, she felt truly alone. She backed into the room and barred the door. She sat in the darkness, her good hand resting on a heavy iron pestle, and listened to the sounds of the night, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. She didn't know that just across the street, a lone figure had settled into the deep shadows of the blacksmith's awning. He sat on an overturned barrel, his back against the wall, his rifle resting across his lap. He didn't make a sound. He just sat and watched, his pale, unblinking eyes fixed on the door of her clinic. Jonah Vale stood his silent, solitary guard, a promise kept in the language he knew best, waiting for the dawn. The rain that had begun as a gentle mist on the church steps was a liar. It was the soft-spoken prelude to a declaration of war. By midnight, the sky over Sagebrush Crossing had torn open. This was not a cleansing shower. It was a deluge, a biblical flood unleashed upon the parched, waiting land. Rain fell in solid, wind-driven sheets, hammering on the tin roofs of the town until the sound was a deafening, continuous roar. The main street turned into a river of churning mud, lightning, stark and blue-white, bleached the world of color for a split second, followed by claps of thunder so profound they seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings. Out at the Sweetwater Marsh, the storm was a force of creation and destruction. The water level, already artificially high from Pike's manipulations, began to rise at an alarming rate. The network of creeks that fed the marsh became raging torrents, carrying with them a payload of rocks, branches, and debris. All this water, this immense pressure, slammed against the series of crude, hidden dams that Pike's men had built. The dams were clever constructions of packed earth, felled logs, and rocks, designed to look like natural blockages, but they were not natural, and they were not built to withstand this kind of assault. The first one gave way with a deep, groaning shudder, the sound lost in the storm's fury. A wall of pent-up water surged forward, a liquid battering ram, and smashed into the next blockage. A chain reaction began, one after another. The dams disintegrated, not holding against the flood but being obliterated by it. The marsh, which had been choked and suffocated, was suddenly breathing again. A great wave, a churning, muddy tide, roared through the reeds. It was a liquid army, scouring the land, ripping away everything that was not deeply rooted, everything that was false. The water was like a force of judgment, rolling through the darkness, washing the landscape clean of its secrets. And as the torrent ripped through the newly surveyed lots, it tore Pike's red-painted stakes from the earth. They were not sunk deep. They were not permanent. They were pins on a map, and the map was now being erased. One by one, they were uprooted, bobbing and spinning in the current, their bright red tops like drops of blood in the churning brown water. They floated aimlessly, evidence of a plan that had been literally washed away, proof that this was never a legitimate survey, but a temporary and malicious fiction. At dawn, the rain softened to a steady, heavy downpour. Judge Hollis, true to his word, was not deterred. He stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, his face set like granite. "Get your coats," he said to the dozen men he had deputized as a jury of citizens, the blacksmith, Elias the store owner, and 10 other ranchers and merchants. "And bring lanterns. The truth doesn't wait for good weather." The procession that rode out to the marsh was a somber one, a line of slicker-clad men on horseback, their lanterns casting bobbing, golden circles of light in the gray. Wet morning. Jonah and Lila rode with them. They found a scene of utter transformation. The marsh was swollen, alive, the water flowing freely through channels that had been dry for months. The air smelled clean and wet, the scent of rain-soaked earth and crushed vegetation. And there, floating in the eddies and caught in the reeds along the bank, were Pike's stakes. The blacksmith waded into the shallows and pulled one out. "This wasn't set to last," he rumbled, holding it up for the judge to see. Sunk barely a foot deep. They followed the path of the flood, their horses splashing through the newly formed streams, and they found the remains of the dams. The evidence was irrefutable. The logs had been sawn, the ends clean and sharp, not the jagged breaks of natural deadfall. The piles of rock were clearly man-made, out of place in the soft, alluvial soil. The townspeople held their lanterns close, the light glinting off the wet, scarred wood, illuminating the truth for all to see. Judge Hollis turned to Cormac, the railroad foreman who had been brought along in handcuffs. Cormac's face was the color of ash. He had seen his bonus, his job, and his future washed away in the night. His bluster was gone, replaced by the cornered look of a man with no more cards to play. "Mr. Cormac," the judge said, his voice quiet but carrying a terrible weight. "I see saw marks. I see man-made dams. I see survey stakes that a child could have pushed over. I suggest you tell me who paid you to do this." Cormac looked at the hard, unforgiving faces of his neighbors, at the undeniable evidence strewn all around them. He looked at Jonah Vale, silent and soaked to the bone, and at the fierce, one-armed doctor beside him. The lie died in his throat. "It was Pike," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He paid me a bonus. He said the railroad needed the land cheap, and he'd handle it. He told me where to build the blockages, where to burn, where to set the stakes. He said it was just business. They rode back to town, the confession hanging in the rainy air. They reconvened in the church, water dripping from their coats to form dark puddles on the floorboards. The news had spread, and the room was even more crowded than before. Pike was there, his Eastern lawyer by his side. His composure was back, but it was brittle now, a thin veneer over a core of cold rage. Judge Hollis recounted what they had found and stated that Mr. Cormac had made a full confession. "Now, Luther Pike," he said, his voice echoing in the silent church, "you stand accused of fraud, conspiracy, arson, and attempted murder." Pike stood, his face a mask of indignation. "This is absurd. My actions, and the actions of the railroad, were solely to protect our investment. The marsh is unstable. We were securing the proposed rail line, a project that will bring prosperity to this entire territory." He was trying to hide behind the grand narrative of progress, to paint his crimes as a necessary, if messy, part of building the future, but it was too late. A telegraph had arrived for Judge Hollis an hour earlier. He held it up. "I have here a telegram from the Union Pacific Railroad headquarters in Omaha," he announced. In it, they state that Mr. Cormac was acting far outside his authority. They disavow any knowledge of his unconventional methods and have terminated his employment, effective immediately. "They further state," the judge continued, his eyes locking on Pike's, "that the railroad has no formal business relationship with the Sagebrush Crossing Bank and that you, Mr. Pike, acted entirely on your own." The trap had snapped shut. The railroad, smelling a scandal that could cost them dearly in territorial grants and public goodwill, had cut him loose. He was alone. Judge Hollis delivered his verdict without ceremony. "This court finds that a criminal conspiracy, led by Luther Pike, did exist. A formal warrant will be issued for your arrest. A territorial marshal will escort you to stand trial." A collective sigh of relief went through the church. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "in light of these crimes, this court will address the civil matter of the loan. All punitive fees and compounded interest charges applied to Mr. Vale's account are hereby declared null and void. The principal of the loan is postponed for a period of 1 year, to be repaid under fair and equitable terms. Finally, the Sagebrush Crossing Bank will pay restitution to Mr. Vale for damages to his property and livestock." It was a total victory. Not just justice, but a chance, a clean slate. As the deputy moved to take Pike into custody, the townspeople began to file out, their faces a mixture of shock and sober satisfaction. As Jonah stood to leave, the blacksmith approached him. He didn't say a word. He just looked Jonah in the eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod of his head. It was a gesture of respect, an apology for all the years of suspicion and rumor. Elias, the store owner, clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of solidarity he would never have dared a week ago. One by one, men who had once whispered about the strange, solitary rancher now met his gaze and nodded, a silent, communal admission of their own short-sightedness. Jonah, a man who had been an island, was suddenly, quietly, being welcomed back to the mainland. He and Lila walked out into the rain together. It was a gentle rain now, soft and steady. They stood on the church steps, the whole town moving around them. But for a moment, they were in a world of their own, without thinking, without planning. Lila reached out with her good hand and took his. His hand was large, calloused, the knuckles scarred. His skin was wet and cold from the rain. She expected him to pull away, to retreat back into the fortress of his solitude, but he didn't. He stood perfectly still, his fingers gently closing around hers. He didn't squeeze or caress. He simply held her hand, his stillness a powerful, profound statement. It was an acceptance. It was an answer to a question neither of them had dared to ask. In the quiet space of that touch, a promise was made, heavier and more binding than any word spoken in the church that day. Just then, the pastor began to ring the church bell, not an alarm, but in a slow, steady peal of celebration. the clear notes washing over the town along with the rain. And as the bell rang, the clouds began to break. A single, brilliant shaft of sunlight pierced the gray overcast, illuminating the wet, glistening street. The rain stopped. The water began to recede, leaving behind the clean, rich smell of wet earth and new beginnings. The peace that settled over Sagebrush Crossing was not a quiet thing. It was a tangible presence, as real as the newly washed air and the rich, dark smell of the damp earth. It was in the unhurried gait of the horses, the easy conversations on the general store porch, the absence of the hard-eyed, unfamiliar men who had haunted the saloon. The storm had washed away more than just the dams in the marsh. It had cleansed the town of a festering poison. For Lila Rowan, this newfound peace brought with it a different kind of turmoil. It arrived in the overland mail coach, the same one that had brought her here, now repaired and running on schedule. It was a single, crisp envelope of heavy cream-colored paper, addressed to her in an elegant, flowing script. The postmark was from Santa Fe. She opened it in the quiet of her clinic. The letter was from a doctor, Alistair Finch, a man whose work on infectious diseases she had studied and admired. He had heard of her competence and courage from the circuit judge. He was offering her a position at the new territorial infirmary in Santa Fe. The words on the page were a siren song, a promise of a world she had thought she'd left behind. A generous salary, a clean, well-stocked operating room with new equipment from back east, a staff of trained nurses, a community of professional peers, a life of science and order, free from the daily struggle against dust, ignorance, and the raw, unpredictable violence of the frontier. She read the letter 3 times, the heavy paper cool against her fingertips. She could picture it, all the whitewashed walls of the infirmary, the glint of sterilized instruments, the respectful quiet of a proper hospital. It was everything she had ever worked for. It was a validation of her skills, a ladder out of this dusty, makeshift life. And as she stood there, the letter in her hand, she felt a profound and terrifying sadness. She looked around her own small clinic, the shelves Jonah had helped her build, the cot where Sarah Miller had finally broken her fever, the lingering scent of turpentine and mint. It was crude, it was imperfect, but it was hers, and it was needed here in a way she would never be needed in a city full of doctors. The next day, Jonah rode in from the ranch. The restitution from the bank had allowed him to hire 2 local hands to help with the herd, and the lines of exhaustion around his eyes had softened. He found her staring out the clinic door, the letter from Santa Fe lying open on her small desk. He didn't ask what it was. He simply stood in the doorway, his presence a quiet, solid question. He looked over at the empty storeroom attached to her clinic, the space where she had first set up. "That room is going to waste," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't an accusation. "Just a statement of fact. I suppose it is," she said, her voice distant. He walked over and looked into the dusty, empty space. "The Miller girl," he said. "She's better now, but she can't read a word. None of the ranch kids can. Their parents are too busy or too tired, and the circuit teacher only comes twice a year." He turned back to her, his pale eyes serious. "You have books," he said, gesturing to the small stack of medical texts on her desk. "Thick ones, hard ones. But they're books. What if this room wasn't empty? What if it had shelves, and your books, and maybe some others? Slates for the children, a clean, warm place for them to sit in the winter." He paused, as if testing the weight of the idea. "You could have your clinic here, proper, and the rest could be a reading room, a prairie library." He wasn't looking at her as he spoke, but at the empty room, seeing it not as it was, but as it could be. It was the most eloquent speech she had ever heard him give. He was offering to build a future, a place of healing and knowledge, in the middle of nowhere. He was offering to build it with her. The siren song of Santa Fe suddenly seemed faint and thin, but a different, colder fear took its place. She thought of the ranchers' wives she had met, strong, capable women who were nonetheless defined by their husband's land and their husband's name, their own identities, their own dreams. seemed to have been worn away over time, like river stones, by the constant, grinding demands of ranch life. She turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't be a shadow. Jonah." He looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "A shadow? I've worked my whole life to be a doctor, not to be a rancher's wife," she said, the words coming out in a rush of long-suppressed fear. "I can't just disappear into someone else's life. I can't be the woman who lives in the background of a man's world." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze steady. He looked at her not as a prize to be won or a creature to be sheltered, but as an equal. The understanding in his eyes was absolute. "Lila," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips was still a rare and potent thing. "I've had enough shadows in my life." He glanced briefly towards the hills, towards the ranch and the memories it held. "I don't need a shadow. I need a partner." The word hung in the air between them, simple and solid and shining. Partner. It was everything. It was a promise of shared burdens and shared victories. It was an acknowledgement of her strength, a celebration of her independence. It was the foundation on which a life could be built. And so, they began to work. The days that followed were filled with the quiet, rhythmic sounds of creation. The scrape of Jonah's trowel as he patched the cracks in the storeroom walls. The soft whisk of Lila's broom as she swept away years of accumulated dust. The steady, metronomic beat of his hammer as he built shelves from clean pine boards. They worked in a comfortable, easy silence. Their movements a kind of dance. He would finish a task and find she had already anticipated the next, with the needed tools laid out for him. She would struggle to lift a heavy box with her one good hand, and he would be there, taking it from her without a word. The space, which had been dark and forgotten, was transformed. They whitewashed the walls, and the room filled with light and the clean, sharp smell of new lime. He built the shelves to her specifications, high ones for her thick medical volumes, low ones within easy reach of a child's hands. He built a long, sturdy table for examining patients and a smaller one for reading, with 2 benches. One afternoon, as they worked, Lila saw him run his hand over a rough spot on the wall. He looked down at his own palm, at the still healing wound from the iron spike. Without a word, she put down her rag, went to her medicine cabinet, and returned with a clean bandage and a tin of salve. She took his large, calloused hand in her own and gently, carefully, dressed the wound. He stood perfectly still, looking down at the top of her head as she worked, her auburn hair catching the afternoon light. It was a gesture more intimate than any kiss. The life of the ranch and the town flowed around their project. The new calves, healthy and strong now that the water was clean, could be heard bleating in the distance, a sound like scattered laughter. Luther Pike, his power broken and his reputation in tatters, sold his interest in the bank to a consortium of cattlemen from a neighboring county. He left town on the morning stage, his departure as quiet and unlamented as the shedding of a snake's skin. One evening, after a long day of work, Lila stood alone in the nearly finished room. The setting sun slanted through the clean windows, bathing the white walls in a warm, golden light. She walked back to her small living quarters, unlocked the drawer of her desk, and took out the letter from Santa Fe. She read it one last time, the elegant script a dispatch from a life she would never lead. She folded it carefully, placed it back in its envelope, and tucked it away at the bottom of a wooden chest filled with winter blankets. She locked the chest and put the key away. Her eyes were misty, a quiet mourning for the ghost of a different future. But on her lips, there was a small, certain smile. Later, as they stood on the porch watching the last light fade from the sky, Jonah reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, folded square of white cotton and held it out to her. It was her handkerchief, the one she had bitten down on while setting her own broken bones, the one with his initials, J.V., embroidered in the corner. He had washed it. It was clean, the fabric soft, and it was folded into a perfect, neat square. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his. It was no longer a symbol of her pain and his helplessness. It was something else now, a memento, A shared memory transformed, a promise of care. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded, his gaze on the horizon. A cool breeze drifted in from the grasslands, carrying the sweet, clean scent of new spring growth. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the hills, it cast their long shadows across the dusty yard. They stood so close together that their two shadows merged, becoming a single, unbroken silhouette against the darkening earth. The opening of the Red Kestrel Free Clinic reading room was not marked by a grand ceremony. There were no ribbons to be cut, no speeches to be made. It opened the way a flower does in the high desert quietly, stubbornly, and in its own time. The door was simply propped open one morning, and the life of the town began to seep inside. The large, whitewashed room was filled with a clean, hopeful light. On one side, the clinic was an island of meticulous order, the examination table with its clean sheet, the glass-fronted cabinet with its neatly labeled bottles, the faint, sharp scent of carbolic acid and lavender. On the other side, the reading room was a haven of quiet possibility. Sunlight fell across the low shelves filled with a motley collection of books, Lila's medical texts, a handful of well-worn novels donated by the pastor's wife, a set of primers, and a thick, illustrated almanac. In the corner, at the small table Jonah had built, sat Sarah Miller. Her face, now full of healthy color, was bent in fierce concentration over a slate. Her small finger traced the shape of a letter as she whispered the sound to herself. B-ba. The halting, hesitant sound of a child learning to read was a more beautiful music than any symphony. At the larger table, a young ranch wife named Mary Gable sat with her hand outstretched. A deep, clean cut from a runaway branding iron marred her forearm. Lila wasn't just bandaging the wound, she was teaching, with her one good hand, her splinted arm resting on the table. Lila guided Mary's own fingers, showing her how to clean the wound properly, how to apply the salve, how to wrap the bandage with the correct tension. "You see," Lila said, her voice calm and patient. "You don't need to ride 10 miles to town for a simple cut. You have the knowledge now. You can do this yourself. You can teach your neighbors." Mary looked from her own handiwork to Lila's face, her eyes wide with a dawning sense of her own capability. It was a small moment, a quiet transfer of power. But in this room, it was everything. Healing was not a service to be sold. It was knowledge to be shared. Just before noon, Jonah arrived. He was carrying a long, rectangular object wrapped in a canvas sheet. He leaned it against the outside wall and came in, his presence filling the room. He didn't speak, but his eyes took in the scene, the child with her slate, the two women at the table, and a look of quiet, profound satisfaction settled on his features. He had helped build this. This was the harvest of their shared struggle. He gestured with his head toward the object outside. "It's done," he said. He and Lila went out onto the porch. He unwrapped the canvas, revealing a sign made from a single, wide plank of dark, weathered pine. He had sanded it smooth, but had left the whorls and imperfections of the wood, giving it character, carved into the surface. In letters that were not elegant but were deep and strong and clear, were the words, "Red Kestrel Free Clinic Reading Room." His hand had not been perfectly steady, and the S in Kestrel was a little lopsided. But the imperfection gave it a warmth, an undeniable humanity. It was his work, his hand, his name, his solitary ranch, the Red Kestrel now linked forever with this place of community and care. "It's perfect, Jonah," Lila said, her voice soft. He had brought a small ladder with him. He set it up against the front of the building, just below the porch roof. He climbed up, the hammer and nails in a pouch at his belt, and began to hang the sign. Lila had just finished mopping the floor inside, and the boards of the porch were still slightly damp in places. She stepped up onto the bottom rung of the ladder to hand him a rag he had dropped. As she stepped back down, her boot heel came down on a wet patch. It slid out from under her, a small, sudden loss of balance. She gave a little cry of surprise, her good arm flailing for a moment. She did not fall. Jonah was down from the ladder in a single, fluid movement. He didn't rush or lurch. He was simply there, before she could fully lose her footing. He had closed the distance. His arms went around her, scooping her up from the ground as easily as if she were a child. He lifted her without a word. He held her for a moment, her feet dangling a few inches from the porch. She looked up at him, her heart giving a little flutter that had nothing to do with the slip. His face was so close, his expression unreadable but for the quiet intensity in his pale eyes. A slow smile spread across her lips, a smile of pure, unadulterated happiness. The memory of another, more desperate moment on a broken bridge hung between them, not as a ghost, but as a shared foundation. She laughed, a soft, breathless sound. "Lay me down properly, won't you?" she whispered, her voice full of gentle teasing. A flicker of something amusement. Tenderness softened the hard lines of his mouth. He nodded. He bent his knees and set her on her feet. The movement was not tentative or soft. It was deliberate, firm, and unshakable. He placed her on the solid wood of the porch with the same care and certainty as a master mason laying the first, crucial cornerstone of a great cathedral. It was a gesture that said, "Here, this is where you belong. Solid, safe, with me." From the saloon down the street, the gentle, plinking notes of a banjo drifted on the afternoon air. It was a lazy, simple tune. There were no longer any whispers or cruel jokes attached to the sound. No more speculation about the solitary rancher and the outsider doctor. There was only the quiet, unassuming rhythm of life in a small town finding its way. They stood on the porch, the new sign hanging proudly above them. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the warm, still air. Jonah reached out, his calloused hand, the one she had bandaged, gently cupping her jaw. He tilted her head up slightly. He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of fire and passion. It was a kiss of quiet certainty, of promises kept and futures to be built. It was short and firm, and it tasted of sawdust and sunshine and hard-won peace. It was a kiss that belonged on a wooden porch, under a wide-open sky. When he drew back, the world came rushing back in. But it was different now, sharper and more beautiful. A gust of wind rustled the leaves of the cottonwood trees, carrying the clean, sharp scent of pine from the high country. The sun broke across the newly shingled roof of the clinic, scattering light like a handful of golden coins. From the far pasture, the low, contented call of a cow to her calf drifted on the breeze, a sound as peaceful as a prayer. Lila leaned her head against his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was the surest rhythm she had ever known. "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt, "we'll hold a clinic out by the marsh, for the families on the far side." She felt his chest rise and fall with a deep breath. He nodded, his chin brushing the top of her hair. "Tomorrow," he rumbled, his voice a quiet vow. And the day after that. Far in the distance, as the sun began its slow descent, the first lamps of Sagebrush Crossing began to glow. Small, hopeful sparks against the vast, encroaching twilight. Hope hadn't arrived in a flash of divine intervention or a stroke of miraculous luck. It had been built, board by board, bandage by bandage. It had been forged in the quiet courage of hands that were willing to reach out, to lift, to place things down properly, and to do the hard work of building a life, the right way, together. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach even more listeners, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.